The sun had settled into that golden hour of late May, when the English countryside seemed to pause and hold its breath. St. Mary Mead's gardens were at their most resplendent, the roses heavy with bloom, the herbaceous borders bursting with delphiniums and foxgloves, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass. It was precisely the sort of afternoon that made one believe, however briefly, that the world was a fundamentally orderly place. Miss Jane Marple stood beneath the white canvas marquee that had been erected on the broad lawn of Thornfield House, observing the assembly with the patient interest of someone who had long ago discovered that human nature, in all its contradictions, was infinitely more fascinating than the best plotted novel. At 83, she had earned the privilege of simply watching, and watch she did, her knitting needles clicking away with metronomic precision as she worked on a pale blue cardigan, a gift she had decided for her great-nephew James. "Quite the turnout," remarked Mrs. Bantam, settling herself into the wicker chair beside Miss Marple, with the satisfied sigh of a woman who had successfully navigated the buffet table and secured the choicest selection of cucumber sandwiches. "I haven't seen so many people gathered here since the Vicar's Jubilee, though I must say the atmosphere feels rather different, wouldn't you agree?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "People do behave differently when there's a wedding to celebrate. It brings out both the best and, occasionally, the more complicated aspects of their nature." Indeed, today's garden party was ostensibly a celebration of the forthcoming nuptials of Miss Caroline Ashford and Mr. Edmund Hartley. Caroline, the only daughter of the late Colonel Ashford, was one of St. Mary Mead's most prominent young women, educated, accomplished and possessed of that particular brand of quiet beauty that suggested breeding rather than mere prettiness. Edmund Hartley, a successful architect from London, had arrived in the village some 8 months prior when he was commissioned to oversee renovations to the old Hartfield estate, which his family had inherited from a distant cousin. He was handsome in that careless way of men who have never needed to think too carefully about their appearance, with dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples, and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to moving through the world with ease. The engagement had been announced 3 months ago, and the wedding was set for the first Saturday in June, merely 2 weeks hence. Yet, as Miss Marple observed the gathered assembly, she noticed several details that might have escaped the attention of less practiced eyes. Caroline, for instance, wore her engagement ring with what might be described as dutiful pride, rather than joyful abandon. She smiled when Edmund approached her, certainly, but her smiles seemed to arrive a fraction of a second after his arrival, as if she had to remind herself to perform the role expected of an engaged woman. More interesting still was the way her eyes occasionally strayed across the garden, to where young Mr. Thomas Blackwell stood chatting with the vicar. A lingering look, quickly redirected, that suggested a history somewhat more complicated than simple friendship. Edmund himself moved through the gathering with the ease of a man secure in his social position, pausing to compliment hostesses and exchange pleasantries with the village worthies. Yet Miss Marple detected in him a certain watchfulness, a quality of attention that seemed at odds with the casual ease of his manner. Twice she observed him follow Caroline's gaze toward Mr. Blackwell, with an expression that might generously be described as polite, but which contained, beneath its urbane surface, something rather more pointed. "I do so hope they'll be happy," Mrs. Bantam continued, lowering her voice in that conspiratorial manner that suggested she doubted it very much. Though between you and me, Miss Marple, I've always wondered if dear Caroline was quite certain about Edmund. Don't you find it curious how quickly their courtship progressed? Why, they were barely acquainted at Christmas, and by February the engagement was already arranged. Engagements often move more swiftly than outsiders might expect, Miss Marple observed mildly, though her knitting needles never slowed their rhythm. People frequently know their own hearts more quickly than we give them credit for. Perhaps, Mrs. Bantam said with the air of one unconvinced, though I've heard rumours, purely speculation, you understand, that Edmund's circumstances may not be quite as comfortable as they initially appeared. Something to do with the family estate and various debts. One does wonder whether— She left the sentence unfinished, but Miss Marple understood perfectly well what she wondered. It was, she reflected, remarkable how often human beings constructed elaborate theories about other people's affairs based on the flimsiest evidence and the most uncharitable assumptions. The truth, in her experience, was rarely as dramatic as the suspicions it engendered. The afternoon progressed with the gentle rhythm of English village social occasions. Tables laden with sandwiches and pastries were progressively depleted. The vicar made several ponderous remarks about the sanctity of matrimony. Mrs. Thornfield, their hostess and Caroline's closest relation by marriage, moved among her guests with the controlled anxiety of someone determined that nothing should mar what she regarded as the social event of the season. The string quartet, hired from the nearby market town, provided a gentle musical backdrop, their rendering of light classics occasionally interrupted by the more robust laughter of village men discussing the cricket season. It was at approximately 3 o'clock that the first unusual occurrence took place, though at the time few recognized it as significant. Miss Marple had excused herself from Mrs. Bantam's company and made her way to the house itself, ostensibly to use the lavatory, but actually to escape the sun, which she found increasingly taxing to her constitution. She had paused in the cool dimness of Thornfield House's entrance hall, allowing her eyes to adjust to the interior shadows, when she heard raised voices emanating from what she knew to be the library, a small room off the main corridor, where the family kept their correspondence and account books. "You promised me," a woman's voice said. Caroline, Miss Marple recognized immediately, though she had never heard that particular note of distress in the younger woman's voice. "You promised we would speak with him before anything was decided." "Plans change." This was another voice, male, with an edge of impatience. "Sometimes circumstances require us to move more quickly than we anticipated. This isn't what we discussed. This isn't—" There came the sound of the library door opening, and Miss Marple, with the instinctive delicacy of a woman who had lived a long life in a small village, had already turned toward the lavatory and was progressing down the corridor with measured steps, her expression pleasantly blank. She did not see who had opened the door. But when she glanced back over her shoulder after emerging from the lavatory some minutes later, she observed Edmund Hartley exiting the library, his face composed, but his jaw rather tightly set, followed a moment later by Mrs. Thornfield, whose expression suggested she had been either very angry or very frightened, or possibly both. Most interesting, Miss Marple thought, settling herself once more in the marquee beside Mrs. Bantam, who immediately resumed her discourse on the various inadequacies of the refreshments. The afternoon light was beginning to shift, deepening from gold toward amber, and the garden party showed signs of winding toward its conclusion. People were gathering their parcels and preparing to depart, offering compliments to Mrs. Thornfield and good wishes to Caroline, who stood beside Edmund as if fulfilling an obligation rather than a desire. It was just as the first of the guests were preparing to leave that they noticed the door to the small cottage at the edge of the Thornfield grounds, the cottage occupied by Miss Letitia Stone, Mrs. Thornfield's elderly mother, stood open to an unusual degree, and no one had seen Miss Stone emerge to attend the party, despite standing invitations. "She often rests in the afternoon," Mrs. Thornfield said quickly when someone mentioned it. "Letitia tires easily. I'm sure she simply had a quiet day at home." But there was something in the firmness of her voice, the slight tension in her shoulders, that suggested she was less certain than her words implied. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully, wound the yarn around the needles with practiced efficiency, and observed the cottage with the quiet attention of someone who had learned over a lifetime that what was left unsaid frequently mattered far more than what was. A garden party, she reflected, was a curious thing. People believed themselves safe in daylight, surrounded by others speaking of pleasant things. They believed that propriety and sunshine somehow prevented the darker aspects of human nature from asserting themselves. And yet, some of the most significant moments in the human story took place in precisely such settings. In the spaces between pleasantries, in the quick glances and hastily suppressed emotions, in the doors that opened when everyone else was looking the other way. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. And in the small cottage at the edge of the garden, in the gathering dimness of late afternoon, something was waiting to be discovered. The scream that came from the cottage was remarkably restrained, the sort of cry a well-bred woman might manage when confronted with something genuinely terrible. It came from young Prudence Hartley, Edmund's 17-year-old sister, who had stepped away to visit her great-aunt Letitia. "Mother, you must come at once." Prudence's voice cut through the pleasant murmur of departing guests. Mrs. Thornfield's transformation was instantaneous. The gracious hostess froze, colour draining from her face, then moved toward the cottage with singular purpose. Miss Marple observed that Edmund's body stiffened at the scream. For perhaps 2 seconds, his carefully maintained composure slipped entirely, his face going white with the sick shock of a man who had been expecting precisely this discovery. Then the mask returned. By the time they reached the cottage, the truth was evident. Miss Letitia Stone sat in her favoured chair by the window, her head tilted back at an unnatural angle, eyes open and unseeing. Beside her sat a half-empty teacup and a china saucer with biscuit remnants. Dr. Addison arrived within the quarter hour. After a brief examination, he stood and spoke quietly to Mrs. Thornfield. "I shall need to contact the police. This is not a natural death. The woman has been poisoned." The word hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. The garden party came to a complete halt. The string quartet fell silent. All of St. Wukas's Mary Mead understood in that moment that something fundamental had shifted in the quiet order of village life. Inspector Blackwell and Sergeant Morris arrived at 4 o'clock, setting about their methodical investigation. Miss Marple, remaining in the marquee, observed details others missed. Caroline Ashford exhibited no shock or distress at her aunt's death, only a subtle relaxation of tension, as if relieved. Edmund spoke rapidly to Inspector Blackwell, volunteering information about his recent arrival and lack of connection to Miss Stone, his vehemence striking for a man merely being asked basic questions. Mrs. Thornfield's hands trembled uncontrollably, and her eyes, when resting upon Edmund or Caroline, held barely controlled anguish. It was Mrs. Bantam who provided the most illuminating revelation. "My nephew works at the bank," she whispered conspiratorially. He mentioned that Edmund Hartley inquired about the terms of Miss Stone's will 3 weeks ago. He wanted to know whether her assets would pass to Mrs. Thornfield upon her death. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Quite considerable, £20,000 or thereabouts. All passes to Mrs. Thornfield, her only child. Edmund would inherit nothing directly, but if he and Caroline married before Miss Stone's death, the money would presumably benefit them." By evening, Inspector Blackwell had established the basic facts. Miss Stone had been seen alive at 1:30 by the housemaid, Annie Crumb, who had brought her tea. The tea contained cyanide. Death must have occurred between 1:30 and 3 o'clock, when Prudence discovered her. During that window, numerous people had access to the cottage. Mrs. Thornfield, Edmund, Prudence, and Caroline had all absented themselves from the garden party at various points. As for motive, it was plentiful. Miss Stone's considerable estate provided reason enough. But there were also personal tensions. Miss Stone had expressed concerns about Caroline's engagement to Edmund, telling the vicar's wife only the previous week that she intended to speak with Caroline about it before the wedding. By nightfall, Inspector Blackwell had taken statements from everyone present. He had examined the cottage thoroughly and confirmed cyanide as the cause of death, occurring no more than an hour before discovery. Yet, as Miss Marple sat in her cottage later that evening, sipping chamomile tea, she found herself troubled by a peculiar inconsistency. The poisoning appeared to be carefully premeditated, requiring knowledge of cyanide, Miss Stone's routine, the timing of her afternoon tea. And yet there was something hurried about it, something reactive rather than planned. The poison had been introduced directly into the tea, suggesting desperation or sudden decision rather than orchestration. More troubling was the matter of who would benefit. Mrs. Thornfield would inherit regardless. There was no urgency, no reason to rush, unless Miss Stone had been planning to alter her will. Miss Marple closed her eyes, her mind moving through the afternoon's events with deliberate precision. The overheard conversation in the library, Edmund's white-shocked face at discovery, Caroline's peculiar lack of distress, the rapid engagement announcement, Edmund's inquiries about the will, and beneath it all, the sense of secrets held too tightly, of promises and plans gone awry. No, she decided, this murder, though neat and calculated in appearance, was in fact the violent eruption of something far more complicated. Multiple desires, multiple deceits, multiple betrayals converging on a single afternoon. Tomorrow, Inspector Blackwell would likely arrest the most obvious suspect and congratulate himself on efficiency. But he would be wrong. Inspector Blackwell was a thorough man, but he was also a practical one. By 9 o'clock the following morning, he had arrived at what seemed to him an entirely satisfactory conclusion. "It's the money," he said to Sergeant Morris as they stood in the sitting room of Thornfield House, reviewing their notes. "Follow the money, and you'll find your murderer." Miss Stone's estate passes to Mrs. Thornfield. Mrs. Thornfield's daughter is engaged to Edmund Hartley, a man with considerable debts and uncertain prospects. The engagement was hasty, remarkably so. The wedding was set for a fortnight hence, which would have allowed Mrs. Thornfield to inherit, and the money would then benefit the young couple. But wouldn't Mrs. Thornfield have inherited the money anyway? Sergeant Morris ventured hesitantly. Why not simply wait for Miss Stone to die naturally? She was elderly. Because, Inspector Blackwell said with the air of a man explaining something obvious to a dull student, Miss Stone was threatening to alter her will. We have statements from 3 villagers that she had expressed intention to do precisely that. She believed Edmund unsuitable for Caroline. A few weeks' delay could have cost them £20,000. It was logical. It was neat. It was, in short, exactly the sort of solution that inspectors preferred, one that resolved itself into clear motive and apparent method. By noon, Mrs. Thornfield had been taken into custody for questioning. She was a dignified woman, even in her distress, sitting across from Inspector Blackwell in the small police office with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. But the tremor in her voice when she spoke was unmistakable. "I did not poison my mother," she said quietly. "I loved her, whatever difficulties existed between us. And I would have inherited her money regardless of when she died. There was no urgency. Yet your daughter was engaged to a man with financial difficulties," Inspector Blackwell countered. "And your mother had made clear her disapproval. A few weeks could have made significant difference to your plans." "My plans," Mrs. Thornfield repeated, something like bitterness entering her voice, "were never mine alone to make." But when pressed further, she would say nothing more. She maintained her innocence steadfastly, yet she also refused to elaborate on what she meant by that cryptic statement. The village, meanwhile, had erupted into that particular form of controlled hysteria that characterizes small communities in the grip of scandal. Every conversation in every parlor and shop revolved around the poisoning. The consensus, influenced heavily by Inspector Blackwell's visible focus on Mrs. Thornfield, had settled upon her guilt with the certainty of a jury that had already made up its mind. "She always was rather cold toward her mother," Mrs. Bantam opined to half the village. "And the financial motive is so obvious. I'm sure the inspector will have sufficient evidence to charge her within days." It was on the morning of the 3rd day after Miss Stone's death that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Caroline Ashford arrived at the cottage in St. Mary Mead where Miss Marple lived, her face pale and drawn, her usually composed demeanour fractured with evident distress. "Miss Marple," she said without preamble, "I need to speak with you. I cannot speak to the police, but I must speak with someone, and I have always believed you to be a woman of discretion and understanding." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gestured to the chair opposite her own. "Please, sit, dear. Tell me what troubles you." Caroline sat, her hands twisting together in her lap. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Then the words came in a rush. "My mother did not poison Aunt Letitia, but I know who did, and I cannot tell the police because if I do, I will destroy everything. I will destroy my mother's reputation, my own prospects, perhaps even Edmund's future. And yet I cannot remain silent and allow my mother to be convicted of a crime she did not commit." "Then you must tell me," Miss Marple said gently, "and perhaps together we can find a way through this." Caroline took a shuddering breath. "The conversation you heard in the library, I know you heard it, Miss Marple. Everyone hears everything in a village, and you have always been observant. Edmund and my mother were arguing about what Aunt Letitia had discovered. She had found something, a letter, something that was compromising." "Compromising to whom?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "To Edmund. It was from a woman in London, a woman he had been involved with before he came to the village. She was married, Miss Marple. Edmund had conducted an affair with a married woman, and when he ended it to pursue me, the woman became vindictive. She had written a letter, threatening to expose him if he did not continue the relationship. and Miss Stone discovered this letter. She was looking for something else. She had become convinced that Edmund was marrying me for money. She was searching through the desk in the library where Edmund had been keeping his correspondence. She found the letter from the woman in London. She was horrified. She said she would tell me, would warn me away from him before the wedding. Caroline's voice dropped to barely a whisper. My mother argued with her about it. She said it would ruin Edmund, ruin the engagement, ruin everything. And Aunt Letitia was adamant. She said she had a duty to protect me, that she would not allow me to marry a man capable of such deception. What happened then? Miss Marple asked, though she thought she already knew. My mother left. She said that nothing could be done, that Aunt Letitia had made up her mind. But someone else must have overheard the argument. Someone else must have known that Aunt Letitia was going to speak with me, was going to insist I break the engagement. Caroline looked up at Miss Marple with desperate eyes. It wasn't my mother, Miss Marple. I swear it wasn't. But whoever it was, they poisoned Aunt Letitia to keep her from telling me the truth about Edmund. And if I reveal what I know, if I tell the police about the letter and the London woman, then it all comes out, everything, and I cannot bear it. Miss Marple regarded the young woman with the compassionate understanding of someone who had seen human nature in all its complexity. Dear child, she said softly, I believe you, but silence now will only prolong the injustice. Your mother is being questioned under suspicion of murder. That injustice cannot continue. But what about the scandal? Caroline whispered. What about my reputation? Your reputation, Miss Marple said, will survive truth far better than it will survive the conviction of an innocent woman. Come, we shall go to Inspector Blackwell together, and you shall tell him everything you have told me. The rest will follow as it must. Inspector Blackwell received Miss Marple and Caroline Ashford in his office with the irritation of a man whose neat conclusions were being disrupted. He had already begun drafting the charges against Mrs. Thornfield, and the arrival of Caroline with fresh information struck him as an inconvenient complication, rather than a helpful development. Yet, as Caroline spoke, her voice trembling but her account methodical, even he could not ignore the significance of what she revealed. The letter from London, he said, making notes with sharp, economical strokes. You say Miss Stone discovered it while searching through Mr. Hartley's correspondence. Yes, she was looking for financial documents. She believed Edmund was in debt and was marrying me for my mother's potential inheritance. When she found the letter instead, she was appalled. She felt obligated to warn me. And your mother argued with Miss Stone about this? My mother wanted to give Edmund the opportunity to explain. She wanted to handle it privately. But Aunt Letitia was determined to speak with me before the wedding. Inspector Blackwell set down his pen. Miss Ashford, I must ask you directly, did you poison your great-aunt? No, Caroline said firmly, and I do not believe my mother did. But whoever did must have overheard the argument between my mother and Aunt Letitia. Whoever did must have known what Aunt Letitia intended to do. The cottage door was locked from the inside, Sergeant Morris offered. The housemaid, Annie Crumb, locked it herself when she left after delivering the tea at 1:30. No one could have entered to administer the poison directly. Then it was in the tea itself, Miss Marple said quietly, which means the poison must have been added before Miss Crumb delivered it, or after, during the window before Miss Stone's death. Inspector Blackwell's eyes narrowed. We have Miss Crumb's statement that she prepared the tea in the kitchen, delivered it at precisely 1:30, and observed Miss Stone begin to drink it. The poison could not have been added after delivery, without Miss Stone's awareness. Then it was added before, Caroline said. Someone had access to the kitchen between the time the tea was prepared and the time Annie delivered it. What followed was a thorough re-examination of the household's movements during the critical period. Annie Crumb, the housemaid, maintained consistently that she had prepared the tea, left it to cool briefly while she attended to other garden party duties, and then carried it directly to the cottage. Who had access to the kitchen during those few minutes? Inspector Blackwell demanded. The answer emerged with uncomfortable clarity. Mrs. Thornfield, certainly. Edmund Hartley, who had briefly come inside for a glass of water. Caroline Ashford herself, seeking to find a quiet moment away from the party. And Prudence Hartley, who had stepped inside to use the lavatory. "We're back where we started," Sergeant Morris said in frustration. "Multiple suspects, all with opportunity." But Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner of the office where Inspector Blackwell had allowed her to remain, had begun to see something that the inspector, in his focus on the obvious, had missed entirely. The overheard conversation, the letter about the London affair, Edmund's desperate, white-shocked reaction to the news of the poisoning, Caroline's relief at her aunt's death, and beneath it all, another thread entirely, one that had nothing to do with inheritance and everything to do with protection. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "might I inquire whether the letter from London has been recovered?" Inspector Blackwell stared at her. The letter? The one Miss Stone discovered, the one that prompted the argument between her and Mrs. Thornfield. If the letter was motivation enough for murder, surely it must still exist somewhere. A search of Miss Stone's cottage revealed nothing. A search of the library at Thornfield House, where the discovery had been made, also yielded no letter. The police then requested permission to examine Edmund Hartley's belongings, which he provided with a calmness that seemed almost rehearsed. No letter was found. "Someone removed it," Inspector Blackwell said grimly. "Someone who knew what it contained and what it might reveal." Edmund was brought in for questioning that afternoon. He presented himself with the composed bearing of a man of education and means, yet Miss Marple, observing from the corridor through the slightly open door, noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers occasionally clenched into fists before he forced them to relax. "I did not poison Miss Stone," he said to Inspector Blackwell. "Yes, there were complications in my past. There was a woman in London. It was a mistake, a foolish error of judgment on my part. But I ended the relationship and came to the village precisely to make a fresh start. And Miss Stone discovered evidence of this relationship. Yes, my former acquaintance had written to me. The letter was unfortunate, but hardly criminal. It was merely a woman expressing her displeasure at being abandoned. Yet it was important enough that someone murdered to prevent Miss Stone from revealing its contents," Inspector Blackwell said pointedly. "That is not my doing," Edmund said coolly. "I do not know who poisoned Miss Stone, but I assure you it was not I. What would be the point? The letter revealed nothing that would have harmed me permanently. It would have been embarrassing, certainly, but hardly grounds for murder." Miss Marple made note of this assertion. He was correct, of course. The scandal of an affair, while damaging to his reputation, would not have been catastrophic. Young men in London did worse and survived socially. Edmund's wealth and position would have insulated him from the worst consequences. Which meant, she reflected, that the letter's contents were more significant than a mere account of infidelity. That evening, as Miss Marple walked through the village toward her cottage, she encountered Prudence Hartley near the church. The girl was seated on the bench beneath the ancient yew tree, her face pale, and her eyes red from crying. "Miss Marple," Prudence said, looking up. "Everyone believes my mother poisoned Aunt Letitia. But she didn't. I know she didn't." "How do you know that?" Miss Marple asked gently, settling herself beside the girl. "Because I know who did," Prudence said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know what to do. If I tell the police, everything will come out. If I don't tell them, my mother will be convicted. But either way, my family will be destroyed." "Tell me," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes speaking aloud clarifies what we must do." Prudence took a shuddering breath. "When I left the garden party to visit Aunt Letitia, I went into the house first. I needed to use the lavatory. While I was inside, I heard voices in the kitchen. Aunt Letitia's voice and someone else's. They were arguing. Arguing about what? About a letter. Aunt Letitia was saying that she had to tell Carolyn that she couldn't let her marry Edmund without knowing the truth. And the other person kept saying that it would ruin everything, that the truth would destroy too many people, that there had to be another way. "Did you see who it was?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "No, but I recognized the voice. It was someone I know very well, someone I care about very much. And Miss Marple, they were holding a small bottle. I saw it in their hand, a brown glass bottle with a stopper. They said they had to do something, that there was no other choice." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "And then I fled. I went upstairs and locked myself in the lavatory, and I stayed there until I thought they had gone. I didn't want to see them. I didn't want to know. But I did see, and I do know. And now I'm trapped between protecting someone I love and allowing an innocent woman to be convicted of murder." The evening light was fading, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its twilight song, and beneath the surface of this quiet village, Miss Marple thought, lay secrets and betrayals as complex and destructive as anything found in the great cities. "Tell me," she said to Prudence, "is the person you saw still determined to allow Mrs. Thornfield to be convicted?" Prudence looked at her with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know any more what they're determined to do. I only know what they did, and I know that I can't keep this secret any longer." The next morning dawned grey and uncertain, with clouds gathering on the horizon, as if the very weather conspired to mirror the emotional turbulence that had seized St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and took her breakfast in the small sitting room that overlooked her garden. The roses were in full bloom, pink and crimson and pale apricot, their beauty somehow rendered almost melancholic by the knowledge of the darkness that lurked beneath the village's tranquil surface. She had spent much of the previous evening considering Prudence's revelation, turning the facts over in her mind with the careful deliberation of someone assembling a complex puzzle. The brown glass bottle was significant. Such containers were commonly used for poisons, for substances one wished to keep hidden. The overheard conversation suggested someone who felt compelled to act, who believed themselves driven to an act they would not otherwise have contemplated. But which member of the household had Prudence seen? By mid-morning, there came a knock upon her door. Miss Marple was not surprised to find Edmund Hartley standing on her threshold, his expression drawn, and his usual composed manner noticeably strained. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I must speak with you privately. I believe you are a woman of discernment, and I find myself in need of counsel." She invited him inside, settling him in the comfortable chair by the window. He sat rigidly, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles whitened, his dark eyes fixed upon some point beyond the room itself. "I did not poison Miss Stone," he began, "but I know who did, and I have been attempting to decide whether my loyalty should lie with the person responsible or with justice itself." "Those are not necessarily contradictory," Miss Marple said gently. "True loyalty sometimes requires us to allow those we care for to face the consequences of their actions." Edmund's laugh was bitter. "You speak as though you already know. Perhaps you do. You seem to be a woman for whom very little escapes notice." "I have learned," Miss Marple said, "that human nature follows certain patterns. The person who poisoned Miss Stone did so not for money, but for protection. They sought to prevent the revelation of something they believed would cause irreparable harm. And if I tell you that person is someone I care for deeply, someone whose life would be utterly destroyed by exposure, then I would say that destroying an innocent woman, your future mother-in-law, is hardly an act of love or protection." Edmund rose abruptly and moved to the window, his shoulders tense. "Mrs. Thornfield is innocent. I know that with certainty, and Inspector Blackwell will eventually realize it, though perhaps not before considerable damage is done to her reputation and peace of mind." "Then why do you come to me?" Miss Marple asked. "Why not go directly to the inspector with whatever knowledge you possess?" "Because," Edmund said, turning to face her, his expression anguished, "the person responsible is Caroline's younger sister Margaret. She overheard the argument between Mrs. Thornfield and Miss Stone. She learned what the letter contained, not merely evidence of my past indiscretion, but something far more damaging. The letter revealed that the woman I had been involved with was not simply married, but married to a man of considerable influence and wealth. It revealed that I had been engaged in what could be construed as blackmail, accepting payments from this woman to maintain our relationship, and subsequently threatening to expose it if she did not continue those payments." The confession hung in the air between them. Miss Marple considered this revelation carefully, understanding now why the letter had been so vital to recover, why its contents had been worth killing for. "Caroline discovered this?" she asked. "No. Margaret found the letter before Miss Stone could give it to her. Margaret, who has always been protective of Caroline, who has always resented me, though she has hidden it well, understood that the revelation would not merely damage me. It would shatter Caroline's hopes and expose our entire family to scandal. She acted impulsively, without thought for the consequences beyond the immediate moment. She is 17 years old," Miss Marple said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Yes, a frightened girl who made a terrible decision in a moment of panic. She obtained the cyanide through a chemistry student at the school where her friend's brother studies. A foolish, reckless act, but one made without true understanding of what she was doing. She meant only to frighten Miss Stone, to prevent her from speaking. She did not truly comprehend that cyanide was fatal, or perhaps she did not allow herself to comprehend it. But it was fatal, Miss Marple said quietly. And now an innocent woman faces potential conviction for a crime committed by a frightened child. Edmund's voice was hollow. "What would you have me do, Miss Marple? If I expose Margaret, her life is over. The legal system will not be merciful to a girl of 17 who has committed murder, however unintentional her knowledge of its consequences. But if I remain silent, Mrs. Thornfield's suffering continues, and justice is perverted." Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out upon the garden where her roses bloomed in defiant beauty. "You must tell Inspector Blackwell," she said finally. "You must do so today, before Mrs. Thornfield is formally charged. The truth, however painful, is the only path forward that preserves any integrity for you or your family. And if I do not—" "Then I shall tell him myself," Miss Marple said, turning to face Edmund with an expression of such gentle but implacable resolve that he seemed to shrink beneath her gaze. "I have lived a long life, Mr. Hartley, and I have learned that protecting the guilty harms not only the innocent, but the guilty themselves. Margaret committed this act in a state of emotional distress, acting without full rational judgment. The courts recognize such circumstances. She may face consequences, but they need not be as severe as they would be for someone acting with premeditation and malice." Edmund stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "I shall go to Inspector Blackwell this afternoon, but I ask you to remain present when I do. I cannot face this alone." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Inspector Blackwell sat in his office with Edmund Hartley, Miss Marple, and after much persuasion, Margaret Ashford, a pale, trembling girl with her older sister's features and her mother's dignity, though that dignity was currently fractured by terror and remorse. The confession came haltingly, in fragments, as Margaret struggled to articulate the panic and fear that had driven her to commit an act so far beyond the scope of her normal nature that she could scarcely believe she had done it. "I heard Aunt Letitia tell Mother that she would ruin Edmund," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "Not because she was cruel, but because she believed it was her duty. And I thought if she spoke to Caroline, everything would collapse. Caroline would call off the wedding. Edmund would be disgraced. Mother would be heartbroken. And I couldn't bear it." "So you obtained the cyanide," Inspector Blackwell said, his tone carefully neutral. "A boy at school. His older brother studies chemistry at university. I said I needed it for an experiment. He didn't ask questions. I didn't truly believe. I didn't think it would—" She could not continue. The room fell silent, except for the sound of her quiet weeping. Inspector Blackwell exchanged a glance with Sergeant Morris. Then, with visible reluctance, he began to document the confession that would, by day's end, transform a suspected murderer into a victim of tragic circumstance, and a frightened girl into the terrible proof that evil often wears the face of desperation rather than malice. News travels through a village with the inevitability of water finding its course downhill. By evening, St. Mary Mead knew that Margaret Ashford had confessed to the poisoning of Miss Letitia Stone. The revelation struck the village with the force of an unexpected blow, and in its aftermath, the neat narratives that people had constructed began to crumble like old plaster. Mrs. Thornfield was released immediately, her name cleared of suspicion, though the damage to her reputation proved more difficult to dismiss. She returned to Thornfield House as evening fell, moving through the rooms with the uncertain gait of someone who had survived a profound shock and was still determining whether she remained intact. The household staff, aware of the developments, treated her with a careful deference that barely concealed their curiosity and their judgment. It was Caroline who found her mother in the library, standing before the desk where Miss Stone had made her discovery, her hand resting upon its polished surface as if drawing strength from the solid reality of wood and varnish. "Mother," Caroline said softly from the doorway, "you should rest." The doctor said, "I should have believed her," Mrs. Thornfield interrupted, her voice hollow. "Letitia tried to tell me the truth about Edmund, and I refused to listen. I was so concerned with appearances, with the wedding, with securing your future, that I could not hear what she was attempting to say. You could not have known what Margaret would do, Caroline replied, moving into the room. No one could have predicted such a thing. Could we not? Mrs. Thornfield turned to face her daughter, and her eyes held an expression of such profound sorrow that Caroline's breath caught. We live in a world where young girls are taught that their value lies in marrying well, in securing a good match, in maintaining the respectability of their families. Is it any wonder that Margaret, loving you as she does, believed that destroying an obstacle to your wedding was a reasonable course of action? Caroline had no answer to this. She sat heavily in one of the leather chairs, her engagement ring catching the lamplight in fractured brilliance. The wedding must be called off, Mrs. Thornfield said with sudden decisiveness. Edmund will withdraw, of course. His reputation is thoroughly destroyed, and no decent family would allow the engagement to continue. Mother, Edmund is not responsible for what Margaret did. No, Mrs. Thornfield agreed, but he is responsible for the circumstances that made her desperate enough to do it. His past, his deceptions, his blackmail, these are the threads that, when pulled, unraveled our entire family's peace. At the police station, Inspector Blackwell was conducting a more thorough examination of Margaret's situation. The girl sat in a small interview room, her parents flanking her like sentinels. Her solicitor, hastily summoned from Market Coppingham, monitoring every question with vigilant concern. I need to understand the timeline, Inspector Blackwell said, his tone neither unkind nor sympathetic, but carefully neutral. You overheard the conversation between your mother and your great-aunt at what time? Approximately 1:15, Margaret said, her voice thin and papery. I had come inside to use the lavatory. I heard them in the kitchen speaking quietly, but with urgency. I understood immediately what Aunt Letitia intended to do. And you decided at that moment to poison her. No, Margaret said firmly. I didn't decide anything at first. I was simply horrified, frozen. Aunt Letitia was talking about the letter, about Edmund's deceptions, about how she had a duty to warn Caroline. And Mother was trying to reason with her, asking for time, asking for mercy. But Aunt Letitia would not yield. The solicitor interjected with a cautionary gesture, but Margaret continued regardless. It was only when I heard Mother say that nothing could be done, that Aunt Letitia had made her final decision, that I knew I had to act. I obtained the cyanide from Thomas Brennan, whose brother studies chemistry. I didn't truly comprehend that it would kill her. I thought it would make her ill, perhaps seriously ill, but not. Her voice trailed into silence. The truth was evident in her face. A girl who had committed a desperate act in a moment of panic, who had believed she was preventing a disaster, and instead had created one infinitely worse. Across the village, at the vicarage, the Reverend and Mrs. Thornton sat in their study, discussing the extraordinary events with the gravity usually reserved for matters of theological import. Mrs. Thornton, who prided herself on her moral clarity, found herself unexpectedly uncertain. The girl deserves punishment, she said to her husband. One cannot condone the taking of a life, regardless of intention or age. And yet, the vicar replied, adjusting his spectacles thoughtfully, one cannot help but observe that Margaret Ashford acted from a motive that, while misguided, was not fundamentally vicious. She sought to protect her sister. In what way is this fundamentally different from the protective impulses that God himself is said to embody? The difference, Mrs. Thornton said with some asperity, lies in the consequences of her actions. good intentions do not absolve one of responsibility for evil deeds. True, the vicar conceded, and yet I wonder whether our justice system adequately distinguishes between the calculated malice of a murderer and the desperate, irrational act of a frightened child. At Miss Marple's cottage, she sat with her knitting as the evening deepened into night, though her needles were quiet in her lap. She gazed out into the garden, where the roses seemed almost luminous in the gathering darkness, and reflected upon the strange justice that human systems attempted to achieve. The truth had emerged, yes. The innocent had been exonerated, yes. And yet the resolution felt incomplete, even troubling. A 17-year-old girl would face legal consequences for an act committed in emotional desperation. Mrs. Thornfield would bear the knowledge that her sister had died attempting to protect her daughter, and that her desire to shield the family from scandal had contributed to that death. Caroline would inherit the knowledge of Edmund's true character, his capacity for deception and manipulation, perhaps forever questioning whether love could survive such disillusionment. And Edmund himself would have to live with the awareness that his actions had set in motion events that destroyed a family and resulted in the death of an elderly woman and the imprisonment of a girl. There was, Miss Marple reflected, a symmetry to it all. Not the neat, satisfying symmetry of a perfectly executed plan, but the more complex symmetry of consequence and cause, of seeds sown in thoughtlessness and reaped in devastation. She picked up her knitting needles again and began to work, the rhythmic click, click, click filling the quiet cottage. Outside, the night deepened. The village slept, or attempted to, haunted by the knowledge of what had transpired in its midst. And Miss Marple, as she had always done, continued her patient observation of human nature, that endless source of surprise and sorrow, of folly and occasional unexpected grace. The magistrate's hearing took place on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Miss Stone's death, in the grey stone courthouse that served the market town of Coppingham. The building itself seemed to embody the weight of justice, all imposing columns and formal severity, as if architecture alone could convey the gravity of the proceedings within. Margaret Ashford arrived with her parents, her solicitor, and the accumulated burden of public scrutiny that had transformed her from an ordinary village girl into the subject of intense speculation and debate. The local newspapers had descended upon St. Mary Mead with the enthusiasm of vultures, crafting headlines that oscillated between youth's act of desperate love and teenage Poisoner Face's justice. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the complicated middle. Miss Marple attended the hearing, seated in the back of the courtroom with her knitting, her presence a quiet reminder that at least one member of the community maintained her composure and her judgment. Around her, the courtroom filled with villagers who had abandoned their ordinary occupations to witness the unfolding of this extraordinary drama. Mrs. Bantam sat 3 rows forward, her expression hovering between sympathy and barely concealed satisfaction at finally possessing a scandal of such magnitude that no detail of it would escape repetition. The magistrate, Sir Harold Winslow, was a man of considerable experience with human weakness and its legal consequences. He listened with evident patience as the evidence was presented. The confession, the timeline, the chemical analysis confirming cyanide as the poison, the testimony of Thomas Brennan regarding Margaret's acquisition of the substance. What distinguished the proceedings from a simple case of homicide was the question of intent. Margaret's solicitor, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Davies, who had driven from London specifically for the case, presented a meticulous argument regarding the distinction between the act of poisoning and the knowledge that poisoning would result in death. "Your Honour," Miss Davies said, her voice steady and authoritative, "my client obtained a toxic substance with the intention of incapacitating an elderly woman long enough to prevent her from revealing information that would have caused severe emotional harm to her sister. She did not, at the time of obtaining or administering this substance, possess the requisite knowledge that cyanide would prove fatal. A 17-year-old schoolgirl, however intelligent, cannot reasonably be expected to possess the toxicological knowledge of a trained chemist." The prosecutor, a severe man named Mr. Ashton, countered with equal firmness, "Your Honour, cyanide is notoriously toxic. Any person with access to basic knowledge of poisons, which is readily available in published literature, would understand that cyanide causes death. The defendant's claim of ignorance strains credulity. She acted recklessly at minimum, with indifference to the probable consequences at worst." The courtroom held its breath as Sir Harold considered the arguments. His fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes, sharp despite his 70-some years, surveyed the assembly with an expression of profound thoughtfulness. "The law," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decades of judicial authority, "must distinguish between different categories of wrongdoing. The defendant stands before this court having freely admitted to administering cyanide to the deceased. That much is established and uncontested. The question before us is not whether she committed this act, but with what degree of knowledge and intent." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the courtroom. "I find that the evidence supports a charge of manslaughter rather than murder. The defendant's own testimony, coupled with her demonstrated lack of prior knowledge regarding poisons, suggests that while she acted recklessly and with profound disregard for human life, she did not possess the specific intent to kill. However, the court cannot ignore the fact that a woman is dead, that a grievous harm has been inflicted upon the community, and that the defendant must bear responsibility for her actions." Margaret swayed slightly, and her mother reached out to steady her. It was not acquittal, but it was mercy of a sort. The legal system's acknowledgement that her crime, while grave, existed in a different moral category than calculated murder. "Margaret Ashford," Sir Harold continued, "you are remanded for sentencing, which will take place in 3 weeks' time at the Assizes in London. That hearing will determine the length and nature of your incarceration." The words hung like a sentence of death itself, though Margaret would undoubtedly walk free, or at minimum, walk at all, whereas her great-aunt could not. After the hearing concluded, Miss Marple found herself approached by Caroline Ashford in the courthouse corridor. The younger woman appeared to have aged years in the intervening weeks, her face drawn and her eyes holding the knowledge of betrayals she had not anticipated. "Miss Marple," Caroline said, drawing Miss Marple aside to a quieter corner of the hallway, "I wanted to speak with you. The wedding is, of course, cancelled entirely. Edmund has left the village. I do not know where he has gone, nor do I particularly wish to know." "And how do you find yourself, dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Caroline's laugh was brittle. "I find myself grateful, in an odd way, for my great-aunt's interference. Had she not discovered Edmund's letter, I would have married a man whose capacity for deception and manipulation I did not understand. I would have discovered these truths only after it was too late to extricate myself with any grace. In a peculiar sense, Aunt Letitia protected me even beyond her death." "And Margaret?" Miss Marple asked. Caroline's expression crumpled briefly before she composed it again. "Margaret acted out of love, misguided though it was. She believed she was protecting me, and now she will pay a terrible price for that love. I suppose there is a lesson in that our attempts to protect those we love often harm them far more than the dangers we fear. There is, Miss Marple agreed, and it is a lesson that human beings seem compelled to learn anew in each generation, despite its being written large across the history of the world. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The roses continued their indifferent blooming, neither more nor less beautiful for the tragedy that had unfolded within sight of their stems. Mrs. Thornfield, having received clearance from the police, had taken up residence again at Thornfield House, though the house seemed changed somehow, its elegant rooms now holding an air of melancholy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the grief and shame that had permeated them. Inspector Blackwell, having solved his case, had moved on to other matters from his professional responsibilities, discharged with competence, if not with any sense of profound understanding regarding the human complexities beneath the surface facts. But Miss Marple remained, as she always did, contemplating the intricate workings of human nature. How love and protection could curdle into destruction. How good intentions could pave a path to irredeemable sorrow. How the quest to preserve happiness often resulted in its definitive loss. A young girl sat in a cell awaiting sentencing. A woman who had lost her mother grieved not merely death, but the circumstances surrounding it. A family bore the mark of scandal that would colour their village existence for years to come. And in the midst of it all, an elderly woman named Letitia Stone lay in the churchyard, her grave adorned with flowers brought by people who had dismissed her in life. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, was a curious thing. It was not healing, though the law seemed to believe it might be. It was not redemptive, though society seemed to hope for that outcome. It was, at best, a way of acknowledging that consequences must follow actions, that the world maintained some structure of accountability, however imperfect. She folded her knitting and rose from her chair as the light faded from the sky. Tomorrow would bring new gossip, new complications, new small human dramas to observe and understand. For now, there was only the gathering darkness and the ineffable sadness of a world that moved forward, as it always did, despite the weight of its own sorrows. The sentencing hearing at the London Assizes took place on a grey June morning, the city damp and oppressive, despite the calendar's promise of summer. Margaret Ashford, now 18, arrived at the Old Bailey in a modest grey dress, her face bearing the peculiar maturity that only profound suffering can impose upon the young. 3 months in remand had transformed her from a frightened schoolgirl into something more austere, a young woman who had been forced to contemplate the full weight of her actions. Miss Marple did not attend the sentencing. Instead, she learned of its outcome through the village grapevine, which delivered the news with its characteristic blend of fact and embellishment. Margaret had received a sentence of 5 years' imprisonment to be served at Holloway Prison. The judge had spoken of the mitigating circumstances of her age and apparent lack of premeditation regarding the fatal consequences, yet had emphasized that taking a human life, however recklessly, could not escape substantial punishment. 5 years. It seemed both insufficient and devastating, too short to truly restore what had been lost, yet long enough to consume the remainder of Margaret's youth. The news arrived at Thornfield House on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by Mrs. Thornfield's solicitor via telegram. When Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Thornfield at the village market 3 days later, the older woman's appearance had shifted again. The temporary respite that the magistrate's hearing had provided The relief at being cleared of suspicion had given way to a deeper, more complicated grief. "She will be 23 when she is released," Mrs. Thornfield said to Miss Marple, as they stood together examining tomatoes at the greengrocer's stall, their conversation carefully calibrated to seem like ordinary village chat to any observer. "Her entire young adulthood consumed, and my mother remains dead. No sentence, however lengthy, can alter that fundamental fact." "No," Miss Marple agreed quietly, "it cannot. Yet the law must attempt some acknowledgement of consequence, however inadequate." Mrs. Thornfield set down the tomato she had been examining with such intensity that it seemed she might crush it. "Do you know what troubles me most, Miss Marple? It is not Margaret's imprisonment, though that grieves me profoundly. It is the knowledge that my own actions, my refusal to listen to Letitia, my prioritization of appearances over truth, contributed to the circumstances that drove Margaret to such desperation. I am in some fashion complicit in my own mother's death." "That is neither fair nor accurate," Miss Marple said gently. "You are not responsible for your daughter's choices, however much you might wish to bear that burden." "Am I not?" Mrs. Thornfield's voice held a quality of such profound self-recrimination that Miss Marple set aside her shopping basket and gave the woman her full attention. "I have spent my life teaching my daughters that security and propriety matter above all else. That marriage to a man of acceptable position was the paramount goal, that the family's reputation must be protected at any cost. Is it any wonder that Margaret, internalizing these values, believed that protecting the family's future prospects justified extraordinary measures? It was a question that had no satisfactory answer, and Miss Marple did not attempt to provide one. Instead, she guided Mrs. Thornfield away from the greengrocer's stall toward a quieter corner of the market, where they might speak without the village's omnipresent observers cataloguing their conversation. "What has become of Caroline?" Miss Marple asked. "She has gone to stay with my sister in Bath," Mrs. Thornfield replied. The village gossip was too much for her to bear. The young men who had once competed for her attention now crossed the street to avoid her. "She is tainted by association with the scandal, you see. Her prospects, which were once so promising, have been substantially diminished. She may still marry. She has sufficient dowry for that. But she will marry as a girl connected to a poisoning, not as a girl who was almost murdered by her own family's weakness and ambition." "And you remain here," Miss Marple observed. "I remain here," Mrs. Thornfield confirmed. "Where else could I go? This is my home. These are my people, however much they judge and condemn. I will remain in Thornfield House and tend my garden and bear the weight of what has occurred, as I must." Over the following weeks, as summer settled fully upon St. Mary Mead, the village's acute interest in the Ashford tragedy gradually gave way to other preoccupations. The initial shock and excitement had faded, replaced by the ordinary dramas of village life, the vicar's nephew's engagement, the dispute between neighbouring farmers regarding a boundary fence, the weather's impact on the gardens. Yet the shadow of what had occurred remained. Margaret's absence was noted at every village event. The empty chair at St. Mary Mead Church on Sunday mornings served as a constant reminder of the capacity for human suffering. And those who had known Margaret, her school friends, her dance partners, those who had taken her for granted as simply another village girl, found themselves changed by the knowledge of what she had done and what it had cost her. Miss Marple received a visitor one afternoon in early July. It was Thomas Blackwell, the young man toward whom Caroline had cast those meaningful glances at the garden party that seemed so distant now. He was perhaps 25, with the earnest bearing of someone whose life had been relatively uncomplicated before the events of May had shattered his quiet assumptions about human nature. "I wanted to speak with you," he said, accepting Miss Marple's offer of tea with visible tension in his shoulders. "Everyone seems to think that I harboured some secret affection for Miss Caroline, and that the revelation of Edmund Hartley's character would have opened the possibility of my courtship. But that is not what troubles me." "What does trouble you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I keep thinking about Margaret, about the fact that she obtained the poison from Thomas Brennan, who obtained it from his brother at university. That chain of circumstance, where small decisions by multiple people converged to create catastrophe. If his brother had been more careful, if Thomas had refused to help her, if Margaret had hesitated for even a moment, any of those small changes would have resulted in a completely different outcome." "That is an observation many people have made," Miss Marple said, "and it is a true one. But it is also an observation that leads nowhere productive. We cannot undo the past, nor can we trace all the invisible threads that lead to consequential outcomes." "But should we not try to understand them?" Thomas pressed. "Should we not examine what we might have done differently?" "We should examine ourselves and our choices, certainly," Miss Marple replied. "But we must do so with compassion for our own inevitable blindness. No one among us can see all consequences of our actions. We can only attempt to act with integrity in the moment, knowing that our understanding is necessarily incomplete." As Thomas left her cottage, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, reflecting on the peculiar burden of knowledge. She alone, it seemed, had understood from the beginning that the surface facts concealed deeper truths. She alone had recognized that the murderer was not the woman most obviously motivated by money, but the girl driven by love and desperation. Yet her insight had changed nothing. The outcome was the same. Letitia Stone remained dead. Margaret Ashford remained imprisoned. The Ashford family remained scarred by scandal and grief. Knowledge, Miss Marple reflected, was not power. It was merely knowledge, a burden of awareness that one carried through the world, observing the patterns of human behavior while remaining fundamentally unable to alter their tragic trajectories. The garden outside her window continued its indifferent blooming. The roses cared nothing for the human dramas that unfolded in their vicinity. They bloomed and faded according to the cycles of nature, utterly unconcerned with questions of justice, intention, or consequence. It was a comfort, in its way, to observe that the world continued regardless of human suffering. It was also a profound sadness. In mid-August, Miss Marple received a letter from Margaret Ashford at Holloway Prison requesting a visit. The handwriting was careful but laboured, the writing of someone learning to contain profound emotion. One Saturday morning, Miss Marple journeyed to London. Holloway's grey stone corridors seemed designed to strip away human dignity. Margaret sat in the sparse visiting room, her prison dress draining what little colour remained in her face. 3 months had aged her beyond measure. "I have had considerable time to think," Margaret said quietly. "And I must acknowledge a difficult truth. I was not purely protecting Caroline. My true motive was far more selfish." She paused, gathering courage. "I have always been overshadowed by Caroline. When Aunt Letitia discovered Edmund's letter, I saw an opportunity to become significant. I told myself I was protecting my sister, but the truth is uglier. I was asserting my own importance, using Caroline's welfare as justification for my will. And now, Miss Marple asked gently, now I have the significance I sought, as the girl who poisoned her great-aunt, but the cost is one I cannot repay. Understanding your motives, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, does not excuse your action, but it contextualizes it within the broader human experience. You were a girl of 17 struggling with identity, in a world that taught you your value lay in marriage and position. That does not excuse what you did, but it reveals the human struggle beneath the act. After visiting Holloway, Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead to find Inspector Blackwell awaiting her. His expression was grave. "We have received information about Edmund Hartley," he said, settling into her sitting room. "The woman in London, his supposed affair, has come forward. His relationship with her was not mere indiscretion. He systematically extracted money from her by threatening exposure to her husband. He moved from one woman to another, repeating the pattern. He was operating as a blackmailer and confidence man." Miss Marple closed her eyes. And Miss Stone discovered this? Her letter documented a crime, not merely an affair. Edmund Hartley faced criminal prosecution, which Margaret's act prevented. The terrible irony settled over the room. Margaret had killed to protect Edmund Hartley, who was himself a criminal predator. She had prevented justice while resulting in an innocent woman's death. "What has become of him?" Miss Marple asked. "He has fled to South America, beyond our reach." That evening, as darkness descended, Miss Marple sat contemplating the case's final complexity. Margaret had poisoned to protect a predator. Mrs. Thornfield had lost her mother to an act shielding the man who had corrupted her daughter. And Caroline had been spared from marriage to a man without conscience. There was terrible symmetry in it. Justice had been achieved, not through law, but through accident and consequence. The guilty man had escaped, the innocent woman had died, and the girl who had committed the act believed she was protecting someone worthy of protection when in fact she had been shielding a predator. The moral universe, Miss Marple understood, was not orderly or fair. It was merely the aggregate of human choices, each driven by incomplete knowledge. One could observe patterns, could trace how one choice led to another, but one could not fundamentally alter the tragedy of human existence itself. She picked up her knitting as darkness fell completely, her hands working without conscious direction. Outside, the August night held its breath, and somewhere in a London prison cell, a young woman sat awake, bearing the weight of understanding that would not diminish her suffering, but at least allowed her to comprehend its dimensions. September arrived with the softening light of early autumn, and with it came an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. It was Caroline Ashford, returned from Bath, her expression bearing the complex mixture of resolve and sorrow that suggested she had made a difficult decision and meant to see it through. "I have come to tell you something," Caroline said, settling herself in Miss Marple's sitting room with visible tension in her shoulders. "Something that has troubled me since the day Margaret confessed, but which I could not articulate until now." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "I am listening, dear." "The wedding dress," Caroline began, and her voice held a tremor. "You remember, I am sure, that I had ordered a wedding dress for my marriage to Edmund. It was being completed by the seamstress in Market Coppingham. After everything occurred, after Edmund fled and the engagement was broken, I did not know what to do with it. The dress represented a future that would never exist, a marriage that should never have happened. She paused, gathering her thoughts. So I gave it to Margaret. Before her sentencing, I visited her in the remand cell, and I gave her the dress, told her that when she was released, when she had served her time and rebuilt her life, she should have something beautiful to mark that fresh beginning. Something that had been made with hope, even if that hope was ultimately misplaced. Miss Marple understood in that moment the title of this entire affair. The wedding dress had been worn once, in Margaret's imagination, in the future she might have had. And it would be worn again, perhaps, though in circumstances none of them could yet envision. "And did Margaret understand what you were offering?" Miss Marple asked. "I believe so. She wept when I gave it to her. She said that it was more mercy than she deserved, and she promised that when she wore it, if she ever did, it would be to a man who valued her for herself, not for her family's position or prospects. It was a small thing, really, but it seemed to matter to her." After Caroline departed, Miss Marple remained in her sitting room as the afternoon light deepened. The wedding dress that was worn twice, once in promise, once in redemption. It was, she reflected, a metaphor for the entire case. The crime itself had been driven by protection and love, however complicated those motives had proven to be. Miss Stone had sought to protect Caroline from a man unworthy of her. Margaret had sought to protect her sister from the knowledge that would shatter her prospects. Mrs. Thornfield had sought to protect her family from scandal, and Edmund, in his way, had sought to protect his secrets and his freedom. Each act of protection had caused harm. Each attempt to preserve what they valued had resulted in its destruction. And yet in that very destruction, something unexpected had emerged. The possibility of genuine redemption, of understanding, of grace offered and accepted. That evening, Miss Marple received another visitor. It was the Reverend Thornton, who arrived with the apologetic bearing of a man who did not wish to intrude, but felt compelled by conscience to do so. "I wanted to speak with you," the vicar said, accepting tea with evident gratitude, "about the matter of Margaret Ashford and the nature of forgiveness." "A topic of considerable importance to your vocation," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Indeed, and one upon which I find myself in considerable confusion. Margaret confessed to a murder born of protection and misguided love. The law has punished her. But the question of whether she should receive the Church's forgiveness, whether God himself has forgiven her, is one that troubles me deeply." "And what do you believe?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I believe," the vicar said slowly, "that God's forgiveness operates according to a logic entirely different from human justice. A human court can only work with facts and statutes, but God, as I understand him, sees the heart. He understands the terrible complexity of human motivation. And I suspect, though I admit this is speculation, that he is far more merciful regarding our errors of judgment than we are toward ourselves." "Then you will visit Margaret?" Miss Marple asked. "I will. I intend to offer her the Church's blessing insofar as I am able. Not absolution of the crime, that remains a matter between her and God, but acknowledgement of her humanity and her capacity for redemption." After the vicar departed, Miss Marple stood at her window, observing the garden as September light painted it in shades of amber and rust. The roses continued their indifferent blooming, untroubled by human drama or moral complexity. They bloomed and faded according to the patterns nature had established, neither rewarding virtue nor punishing vice. Yet, within that garden, within the small cottage that overlooked it, within the village that surrounded them both, human beings continued their eternal struggle to understand each other, to forgive each other, to move forward despite the weight of their own failures and the failures of those they loved. Miss Marple thought of Margaret, sitting in a prison cell with the knowledge of what she had done and why she had done it. She thought of Mrs. Thornfield, remaining in Thornfield House, bearing the loss of her mother and the scandal of her family with whatever grace she could muster. She thought of Caroline, returning to a village that would regard her with a mixture of sympathy and judgment, building a life from the ruins of what she had expected her life to be. And she thought of Miss Letitia Stone, who had meddled and interfered and ultimately died because she had attempted to protect someone she loved from a truth that, however painful, was necessary. "The world is a complicated place," Miss Marple said aloud to the empty room, "and human beings are far more complex than any of us wish to believe." She picked up her knitting again as the light faded. The pale blue cardigan for James was nearly complete. Soon she would need to begin something new, a project for the future, a creation that would take shape beneath her skilled hands as autumn gave way to winter, and winter eventually yielded to spring. Time continued its relentless forward motion, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to human joy. The seasons turned, people lived and died, and sometimes found unexpected moments of grace amid the wreckage of their own poor judgment. And in a small village in England, life gradually settled back into its ordinary patterns, though everyone who had lived through these events would carry their marks forever. Visible to some, invisible to others, but present nonetheless, in the way they spoke to one another, and the care they took with each other's fragile hearts. As autumn deepened toward November, Miss Marple found herself increasingly occupied with a task that had nothing to do with knitting. She was, in essence, composing the case in her mind, organizing it not as a mystery to be solved, but as a narrative to be understood. Not the narrative that the police had constructed, not the narrative that the village gossips had assembled, but the true narrative, the one that existed beneath the surface facts. She had received a letter from Inspector Blackwell, requesting a final meeting to discuss the case's closure. They sat together in her sitting room on a grey afternoon, when the light seemed to refuse to fully emerge from behind the clouds. "I wanted to thank you," Blackwell said, his manner more relaxed than it had been during the investigation itself, "for your discretion throughout this matter. Your observations proved valuable, and your reticence regarding certain details allowed for the investigation to proceed without unnecessary complication." "You are welcome," Miss Marple replied. "Though I confess I am uncertain whether the case has truly been resolved in any meaningful sense." Blackwell looked at her with evident surprise. "The perpetrator has been identified, has confessed, and has been convicted. By any reasonable standard, the case is closed." "The case is closed," Miss Marple agreed. "The mystery has been solved. But the matter itself, the deeper question of what occurred and why it mattered, that remains, I think, somewhat unresolved." "I do not follow you," Blackwell said, settling back in his chair with the air of a man willing to listen, but skeptical of what he would hear. "Consider," Miss Marple said slowly, "what the surface facts tell us. A young girl poisoned her great-aunt in order to protect her sister from an unpleasant truth about an unsuitable fiancé. The crime was solved through confession. The perpetrator was punished, and the village can resume its ordinary life." "Yes," Blackwell said, "precisely. But consider what the deeper facts tell us," Miss Marple continued. A young girl, desperate to matter, to be significant in a world that valued her only insofar as she could make a good marriage, committed an act born of love and fear and the desire to protect someone she adored. Her great-aunt, who sought to expose a truth she believed was necessary, died because of that desire to protect. And the truth she sought to expose, that a man was systematically manipulating and extorting women, was never fully revealed to the world. The criminal escaped. Justice, in the formal sense, was not served. Blackwell was quiet for a long moment. You are suggesting that the case was not solved properly because Edmund Hartley escaped prosecution. I am suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that justice is a far more complicated matter than most legal systems acknowledge. The law can punish what it can prove, but it cannot address the deeper moral questions that underlie criminal acts. Why did Margaret feel so desperate that she believed poisoning was her only option? Why did Mrs. Thornfield prioritize appearances over truth? Why did Edmund believe he could systematically defraud and manipulate women without consequence? These are questions beyond the law's purview, Blackwell said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, but they are questions that determine whether justice has truly been achieved, or merely whether a crime has been punished. After Inspector Blackwell departed, Miss Marple sat in the gathering darkness, considering what she had said and whether it was true. The case had been solved. Margaret was in prison. The village was returning to normal. By any conventional measure, the course of justice had been followed. And yet there remained a sense of incompleteness, of something significant left unaddressed. The wedding dress that Carolyn had given to Margaret seemed to her a more profound gesture of justice than any court verdict. A recognition that the girl who had committed a terrible act was still capable of redemption, still worthy of mercy, still human. Over the following weeks, as winter approached, Miss Marple occupied herself with correspondence. She wrote to Margaret, brief letters offering no false comfort, but genuine acknowledgement of her situation. She wrote to Mrs. Thornfield, expressing her condolences not merely for the loss of Miss Stone, but for the loss of the future Mrs. Thornfield had envisioned. She wrote to Carolyn, who had settled permanently in Bath, encouraging her to build a life based on what she truly desired, rather than on what society demanded. It was near the winter solstice when she received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Blackwell, the young man who had grappled with the philosophical implications of causality and consequence. I wanted to inform you, he said, and there was a quality of quiet resolution in his voice, that I have decided to study law. I have been accepted to Oxford, and I intend to pursue a legal education with the goal of working for legal reform. What prompted this decision? Miss Marple asked. The case, Thomas said. Specifically, the recognition that Margaret Ashford is imprisoned for 5 years, while Edmund Hartley has escaped to South America with wealth accumulated through systematic fraud. That asymmetry troubles me deeply. I want to understand how our legal system might be reformed to address not merely the symptoms of crime, but its underlying causes. That is admirable work, Miss Marple said, though I suspect you will find that legal reform proceeds far more slowly than one might wish. Perhaps, Thomas conceded, but at least I will have attempted it. After he departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The blue cardigan for James was complete, and she had begun work on a more ambitious project, a blanket with a complex pattern that would require her full attention and her considerable skill. As she worked, her mind continued to move through the case, examining it from different angles, considering what it revealed about the village, about human nature, about the limitations of law, and the possibilities of mercy. The wedding dress had become, in her mind, the central symbol of everything the case meant. A dress made with hope for a marriage that should never have occurred, given by the intended bride to the girl who had killed to prevent that marriage. A gesture that contained within it recognition of shared humanity, capacity for redemption, and the possibility of future joy despite present suffering. None of this changed the facts of the case. Miss Stone was still dead. Margaret was still in prison. Edmund Hartley was still a criminal at large. The village was still marked by scandal. And yet, something had shifted. A recognition had occurred that the simple solution, arrest the guilty party and restore order, was insufficient. That justice must somehow account for complexity, for the tangled motivations that drive human beings to terrible acts, for the possibility that understanding and mercy might matter as much as punishment. Miss Marple worked on her blanket as evening fell, the needles clicking their familiar rhythm. Outside her window, the November darkness gathered, and with it came the approach of Christmas, a season of redemption and second chances, of belief in the possibility of transformation despite human failing. It was, she reflected, a season that Margaret Ashford would spend in prison. It was also a season that suggested, however faintly, that even in darkness, light might eventually emerge. That even in suffering, growth was possible. That even in the wreckage of poor judgment and tragedy, grace might find a foothold. The mystery of Miss Letitia Stone's death had been solved. The deeper mystery, the question of how human beings might learn to forgive each other, to understand each other, to coexist despite their capacity for harm, remained eternally unsolved, eternally compelling, eternally important. And that, Miss Marple decided, was as it should be. Christmas came to St. Mary Mead, as it always did, bringing with it the particular poignancy that only a village could achieve, the holly and ivy adorning the church, the careful arrangements of greenery and shop windows, the carols sung in the cold air outside the market. The village resumed its familiar rhythms, though those who had lived through the events of May and June carried invisible marks that no amount of seasonal cheer could entirely obscure. Miss Marple attended the Christmas service at St. Mary Mead Church, sitting in her customary pew and observing the assembled congregation with the practiced eye of someone who had long ago learned to read the stories written in posture and expression. Mrs. Thornfield sat somewhat apart from others, her face composed, but her eyes holding depths of sorrow that no church service could alleviate. The Reverend Thornton spoke of redemption and mercy with an eloquence that suggested he had been meditating deeply on these concepts. And in the voices raised in "O come, all you faithful," Miss Marple heard the human yearning for grace and forgiveness that had always underscored religious faith. After the service, as the congregation dispersed into the cold afternoon, the vicar approached Miss Marple with a letter in hand. "This arrived for you," he said. "It bears the postmark of Holloway Prison. I thought you would wish to have it as soon as possible." Miss Marple took the letter with gentle hands. The handwriting was Margaret's, careful, controlled, yet bearing the weight of genuine emotion in its careful formation. She did not open it immediately, but instead walked home through the village as the winter light faded toward evening. In her cottage, before the fire, she unsealed the letter and read Margaret's words, words that seemed to come from a place of hard-won understanding and acceptance of circumstance. Dear Miss Marple, I write to you as the year approaches its end, a time when one's reflections seem inclined toward the philosophical. I have now served more than half of my sentence, and I find that time, which I believed would pass with unbearable slowness, has moved with surprising swiftness. I think often of the conversation we had at Holloway, and of your suggestion that understanding one's motives does not excuse one's actions, but contextualizes them within the human experience. I have attempted to live according to this principle. I have been attending lessons here, studying history and literature, subjects that interest me deeply. I have been reflecting on the lives of women who came before me, women who also struggled with questions of identity and significance. I have come to understand that my crime, while terrible, was not unique in its underlying causes. It was a particularly destructive expression of desires and fears that are nearly universal. This understanding does not diminish my guilt, but it has, paradoxically, provided me with a kind of peace. I know that when I am released, I will never be merely the girl who poisoned her great-aunt. That will always be part of my history, but it will not be the entirety of my identity. I wanted also to tell you that Caroline sent me the wedding dress at Christmas. I wept when I received it. To hold something so beautiful, made with such care and hope, knowing it was given to me by the woman I had tried to protect, it was almost too much to bear. But I accepted it, and I will wear it some day, just as Caroline promised. Not to a man of position or means, but to someone who values me for myself. That dress will be worn twice, in 2 different futures, both of them redemptive in their different ways. You asked me once whether I believed I deserved forgiveness. I could not answer then, but I believe I can answer now. I deserve the opportunity to earn forgiveness through the life I live after this imprisonment. That is all any of us truly deserve, I think, the chance to be better than our worst moments. With profound gratitude and respect, Margaret Ashford Miss Marple set down the letter and sat in silence for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside her window, snow had begun to fall, light, delicate flakes that would soon cover the garden in white, temporarily obscuring the patterns beneath, though not changing them fundamentally. The letter was, in its way, the true resolution of the case. Not a verdict delivered in a courtroom, but a young woman's recognition that she could transcend her crime through understanding and growth. It was the kind of resolution that no law could mandate, no judge could enforce. It was something Margaret would have to create herself, moment by moment, year by year, through the choices she made and the person she became. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, looking out at the snow gathering on her garden. The roses lay dormant beneath their white covering, waiting for spring. The structure of the garden remained visible even under the snow. The paths, the beds, the patterns that had been established over years of careful cultivation. The snow was temporary, but the garden's essential nature was permanent. It was, she reflected, not dissimilar to human nature. People could change, could grow, could learn from their mistakes and terrible acts. But the fundamental patterns, the essential structures of personality and desire, remained. Margaret would always carry within her the desire to matter, the impulse to protect those she loved, the capacity for dramatic action. What would determine the quality of her life was whether she could channel these traits toward constructive rather than destructive ends. As the year turned toward its final days, Miss Marple found herself at peace with the case in a way she had not been before Margaret's letter. The mystery had been solved. The crime had been punished. But more importantly, the possibility of redemption had been acknowledged, and a young woman had begun the long work of understanding herself and her capacity for both harm and healing. On New Year's Eve, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, her knitting needles quiet in her lap, and contemplated what she had learned through these months of observation and reflection. She had learned nothing new about human nature. Her decades of living had already taught her that humans were capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness, often simultaneously and often in the same act. But she had been reminded again of the complexity underlying even the most apparently straightforward situations. The wedding dress that was worn twice, once in hope for a marriage that should never have happened, once in the future as a symbol of redemption, seemed to her the perfect metaphor for what had occurred. A beautiful thing, created with love and intention, could serve purposes entirely different from those originally intended. It could carry meaning far beyond its material substance. It could represent not merely loss, but the possibility of transformation. As the clock approached midnight, Miss Marple picked up her needles and resumed her work. A new blanket, a new project, a new year approaching with its own mysteries and challenges and opportunities for understanding. The work would continue, as it always did. People would make mistakes. Crimes would occur. But so too would moments of grace, acts of mercy, and the slow, difficult work of becoming more than one's worst moments. In a small village in England, beneath snow-laden skies, life continued. And Miss Marple, ancient in her wisdom, but never in her willingness to be surprised by human nature, worked on, observing, understanding, accepting the fundamental tragedy and occasional beauty of human existence. And that, Miss Marple thought as the new year arrived, was precisely as it should be.